You've made the spreadsheet, maybe more than once. You color-coded it, you set it up on a Sunday night when you were feeling clear-headed and motivated. You assigned every dollar a category: groceries, rent, subscriptions, eating out. And for about 4 days, maybe a week, you actually stuck to it. And then something happened. Not a crisis, not even a big thing. Maybe it was just a bad day at work. Maybe someone canceled on you and you felt that particular kind of lonely that only hits on a Wednesday. Maybe you were just tired and you spent money you hadn't planned to spend, and then the spreadsheet felt ruined somehow. And slowly, quietly, you stopped looking at it. And here's the part nobody talks about. You weren't surprised. Some part of you already knew this was coming. You've done this before. So what do you do with that? If you already know budgets haven't worked for you, and you keep trying them anyway, what does that actually say? Is it a discipline problem? A willpower thing? Are you just bad with money? I want to offer you a different answer. Because I think the budget was never the problem. The conventional explanation goes something like this. Budgets fail because people don't follow through. They lack consistency, or they don't track carefully enough, or their budget is too strict, or they need a better app. And so the solution, according to pretty much every piece of mainstream financial advice, is a better system. More categories, stricter tracking, zero-based budgeting, the 50-30-20 rule, an envelope, a spreadsheet with more tabs. But here's the problem with that logic. And if the issue were purely structural, if it were just about the system, then the people who fail at one budget wouldn't keep failing at every version of a better budget. But they do. You probably have. The structural explanation assumes that your spending behavior is a logical response to unclear financial information. Like, if you just knew exactly where your money was going, you'd naturally spend it differently. But that's not what actually happens. Most people who abandon budgets aren't doing it because they lost track of the numbers. They're doing it because of how they feel. And that is the entire conversation most financial advice skips. Think about it this way. Imagine a person who smokes. They know the statistics, they've seen the warnings, they understand the cost financially and physically. The information is not the missing piece. Something else is driving the behavior. And you wouldn't fix that by giving them a better chart of their cigarette spending. Money works the same way. Spending isn't primarily a rational act. It's an emotional one, and a budget as a tool is entirely rational. It doesn't account for the fact that the person using it is human. Let's start at the beginning of this. Not the financial beginning, but the emotional one. Most of us learned what money means before we could articulate what money is. We watched our parents talk about it or not talk about it. We felt the tension in a household when there wasn't enough of it. We noticed what people bought when they were celebrating, and we noticed what got cut when things got hard. And slowly, over years, we developed what researchers in behavioral economics call a money script, a set of unconscious beliefs about what money represents, what it says about you, and what you're supposed to do with it. For a lot of people, spending money is tied up with something that has nothing to do with money at all. It's about comfort or control or belonging or the feeling, even for a moment, of things being okay, of deserving something, of existing in a world that most of the time asks a lot of you. Brad Klontz, a financial psychologist who's done decades of work on this, found that money disorders, the patterns that keep people financially stuck, are almost never about a lack of information. They're rooted in emotional history, and they play out automatically below the level of conscious decision-making. By the time you're aware you've overspent, the emotional transaction is already done. That's the first layer, the emotional layer. And it matters because it means that when you build a budget, you're building it with your rational brain, the part that wants long-term security, that can do math, that understands compound interest, but then you're expected to execute it with your entire emotional brain running alongside it. The part that's tired, the part that's stressed, the part that just needs this one thing right now. Here's the behavioral layer. which is where this gets really specific. There's a concept called present bias. It's one of the most thoroughly documented patterns in behavioral science, and it basically means that your brain assigns disproportionately high value to what's available to you right now versus what's available to you later. Not because you're irrational. This is actually deeply wired. Your ancestors survived by responding to immediate opportunities and threats, not by optimizing for a retirement account. The preference for now over later isn't a character flaw. It's a feature that's been running in human cognition for tens of thousands of years. And a budget, structurally, asks you to beat that preference every single day. It asks you to feel the discomfort of not spending now in exchange for a future benefit that has no emotional texture. You can't feel security right now. You can feel a new jacket right now. Every time you open your wallet, you are asking present you to sacrifice for a future you who doesn't feel quite real yet. And here's the part that matters. And slow down with me here, because this is the piece. The moment you feel like you've already failed the budget, present bias gets worse, because now there's no future payoff to wait for. The budget is ruined, and all that's left is now. That's why the abandonment happens so fast. It's not weakness. It's a very predictable psychological chain reaction. But then there's the practical reality layer, which is a little different, and I think this one actually hurts people the most. Budgets, even when followed perfectly, often produce a very specific feeling: restriction. And restriction, psychologically, triggers something called reactance, the tendency to want the thing more when you feel like you can't have it. It's the same reason telling someone not to think about something makes them think about it constantly. When your budget says you've spent your eating out money for the month on the 14th, you don't just neutrally redirect. Something in you notices the constraint. And that noticing often builds into resentment, toward the budget itself, toward the person who recommended it, and sometimes toward yourself for needing one. And resentment is not a sustainable emotional state for maintaining any habit. This is why the strictest budgets often produce the most spectacular failures, and not despite the strictness, because of it. So, if all of this is true, if your spending is emotionally driven, if present bias runs automatically, if restriction triggers reactance, then what actually works? The shift I want to offer you isn't a new system. It's a new question. Most people, when they think about money, are asking, how do I spend less? And so they build systems designed to fight their own behavior. Systems that rely on, willpower and vigilance and, daily recommitment. What if the question were, what does money actually need to do for me emotionally? And how do I give myself that in a way that doesn't quietly bankrupt me? Because here's what's true. The coffee you buy on the way to a meeting you're dreading isn't really about coffee. The online cart you fill up at midnight isn't really about shopping. These are emotional transactions that happen to involve money. And if you build a spending plan that ignores that treats every purchase as a purely rational decision, you're not building a plan for yourself. You're building a plan for a version of yourself that doesn't exist. This reframe changes the question from how do I control my spending to what am I spending toward? And is it actually giving me what I think it is? That's a more honest question, and it's one that leads somewhere real. So let's talk about what actually works. And I want to be careful here because I'm not going to give you a list of productivity tips. Everything I'm about to say should connect directly back to the psychology we just walked through. The first thing is this: because we've established that the moment of decision is where present bias thinking reliably wins, the most effective strategy is to eliminate as many of those moments as possible. That's not about willpower. It's about architecture. Set up an automatic transfer to savings or investment accounts on payday before you see that money in your checking account. Not because automation is a life hack, because your rational, future-oriented brain made that decision at a calm moment, and automation locks that decision in before your present-biased brain gets a vote. You're not fighting the bias, you're working upstream of it. The second thing is about the reactance problem. because restriction triggers wanting. A spending plan that works for you long term needs to include deliberate spending on things that genuinely matter to you, not as a reward, not as a cheat, but as an acknowledged, planned part of the system. When you decide in advance that a specific amount is there for guilt-free spending on whatever you want, you've changed the psychological frame from "I'm not allowed" to "I've already handled it." That removes the emotional charge. And interestingly, once the charge is gone, many people find they spend less in those categories anyway, because the craving was partly driven by the restriction itself. The third thing's about what I'd call the failure protocol. And this one's underrated because we know that most budget abandonment happens not at the first overspend, but in the emotional spiral after it, the "I've already ruined it" moment. It helps enormously to decide in advance what you'll do when that happens. Not if, when. Something as simple as, if I go over in a category, I note it without judgment and redistribute from somewhere less important. Now that's it. No drama, no restart, no meaning assigned. The plan contains the failure because you expected it. This completely changes the emotional relationship with the system. And finally, because we understand now that spending is often emotional self-regulation, it's worth asking quietly and without shame what you're actually managing when you spend in the ways that don't serve you. Not to moralize it, just to see it. Because once you can name the emotional need underneath the transaction, you get to choose whether the purchase actually meets that need, or whether something simpler and cheaper might do it better. Here's the thing I keep coming back to. You are not bad with money. You are a person who, like every other person, carries a complicated emotional history into every financial decision you make. You were shaped by the household you grew up in and the meaning money took on there, and the ways you learned to cope when things felt hard or uncertain or out of control. And none of that makes you broken. It makes you human. The reason budgets don't work for most people isn't that most people are undisciplined. It's that most people are trying to use a rational tool to manage something that isn't rational. And the real work, the quieter, slower, more interesting work, is understanding what you're actually reaching for when money gets complicated. That doesn't mean math doesn't matter. It does. But the math only becomes, something you can actually use and when it's sitting on top of a real, honest understanding of who you are and what you're managing. And that's not a problem to solve. It's just something to know. There's something we didn't get into today, something that sits underneath all of this. Because even when people understand their emotional patterns around spending, a lot of them still find they can't change them. And it turns out the reason why has everything to do with identity. Not what you do with money, but who you believe you are when it comes to money. That's what the next video is about. And if anything I said today felt familiar, I think it's going to answer something you didn't know you were asking.